How's it going? I'm just here today to give a little talk. I just had a little something. I've had a lot of ideas of different talks. I always have ideas of different talks. And something that has been percolating for me is identity, which in evolutionary astrology correlates to the moon. Identity, ego is the moon. So I'm going to explore that and talk a little bit about this concept of how our identities, our ego evolves, the evolution of identity. Now, you probably know this already, but just to start with the basics, in evolutionary astrology, we're looking at the moon first as the primary symbol that correlates to self-identity, personality, ego, themes of emotional security. And of course, that does extend to family and home very naturally. And of course, family and home of origin are the foundations of one's sense of security or lack thereof as we come into the world. Now, in totality, we have what we look at as, of course, the trinity of the south node of the moon, the natal moon, and the north node of the moon has this kind of past, present, future aspects of self-identity. And it's also just a reminder that it's also really important to consider not just what's in the fourth house, but the sign that's on the cusp of the fourth house, the IC, and then what that means to be the ruler of the fourth house and where that falls in the chart. The ruler of the fourth house in the chart and that planet in its house and sign is another key piece of identity. Also, you can consider with a house cusp that Cancer is on. So I think that one of the things that's really interesting, of course, is, we're coming from this 20th century era where sun sign astrology became really popular. Actually, it's really funny that I think it was what I had read, it was kind of an unintentional outcome of some work that Dane Rudhyar had done, who was, one of the most brilliant astrologers of the 20th century. I was definitely attracted to his writing early on, and he's been a big inspiration at the start of my journey as an astrologer before I got into evolutionary astrology. Robert Hand, Dane Rudhyar, Stephen Forrest, Demetra George, Isabel Hicks. There was a list of them there, but Dane Rudhyar was definitely up there. And so I came across one of the things that's kind of on a sideways note sort of inspired this talk was this thing I stumbled upon in a Dane Rudhyar book, which I'm going to share briefly. But before we get into that, I wanted to share with you this whole concept of the moon versus the sun, and how, people who have kind of been only exposed to astrology through this mainstream Western sun sign astrology may not totally understand that the moon is really how we know ourselves. This is my EA understanding of it, is that the moon is really our personal self, how we understand ourselves, who we really are, what we identify with, and the sun is an expression of self. I was at a talk one time at NORWAC, Northwest Astrology Conference, and Mark Jones gave an example of kind of like the moon kind of being the container or bowl, and that the solar sun expression was like the flame, or like Cancer and Leo, right? There's the whole kind of who we are is this, container, so to speak, and then from that comes the solar expression. It's an interesting way to think about it because I don't think that we think initially that the solar expression comes from a root in the lunar personality, because the moon can be hidden, the personality can be hidden, the expression is more outward and noticeable, but until we get to know someone's moon sign, we don't really know them. And then I think, as an exercise to think about that is, and I mean, I haven't even, I'm saying this, but I haven't fully done it on myself, but, just to think that of how your own expression represented by your sun in your chart comes from the roots of your self-identity, your moon nature. It's an interesting concept to think about. On that note, I was kind of thinking about this, which came first, sun or moon, so to speak. This is just kind of silly, but since the moon does correlate with the womb and eggs and cycles of fertility, I kind of see it as the ego as a starting point. And it's interesting because in the sun in evolutionary astrology, at least taught by Jeffrey Wolf Green, doesn't correlate with past lifetimes, and it's an expression of the current life purpose. And so it's just like this kind of current alive expression and purpose of the lifetime. But then the moon is more foundational and came before. However, it's interesting to think about in the EA paradigm, you have this whole thing about the moon and the ego, this concept that Jeffrey taught about bringing into focus the soul's evolutionary intention for the lifetime. And so the identity kind of becomes like a focal point to allow the soul's desire to come through. And in this case, obviously, like Pluto and Mars is a lower octave of Pluto, both represent desire. In terms of Pluto and a Scorpio 8th house, it trines the Cancer 4th house moon archetype. And then, of course, that water trinity in EA we talk a lot about with, ego, soul, and spirit, Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces. But if you kind of also think about desire being the initial catalyst or cause or spark for ego to form and bring into focus that desire, and from that in a lifetime there emerges a purpose, a sun for that lifetime. It's interesting, but is this helpful to think about your chart differently? Maybe a little bit. I hope some of these concepts are. So now I think that there are a lot of examples, and there are evolutionary astrologers. I listened to Lauren Albandian give a talk, and she doesn't really prescribe to the sun not correlating to past lifetimes, and I think that a lot of evolutionary astrologers don't hold that really as a hard and tight line. I'm going to get into some of the scenarios and examples about that in a second here, but I wanted to come to you with this little piece about, excuse me. So I was digging up my Lunation Cycle book by Dane Rudhyar, and I was, just perusing it, and I happened to highlight on this page, I totally forgot about this. This was probably, I don't know, like 24 years ago that I was reading this. I haven't read it for a while. So it was totally out of my psyche. Completely forgot about this. I've been so fascinated by this, though, since I read it. And I saw Nicholas Sparkles of Gold the other day, and I told him about it, and go visit my friend, fellow astrologer Gray Crawford here, and going to share with him some of my preliminary research on this, which I know he always gets excited about these kind of things. So that'll be like a little fun thing I'm looking forward to. The concept here is that there are two scenarios for any individual at the time of their birth that represent a relationship between the sun sign that you have at birth and the new moon before the birth. Now, what Dane Rudhyar says is that if the new moon before the birth and the natal sun are in the same sign, then the qualities of that sign and that archetype freely pervade. That's his lingo. It freely pervades the entire being, consciousness, psyche. Okay, that's scenario one, right? Of course, then the other scenario would be that the new moon before birth would be in the sign prior to the sign that the sun is in. Now, if this is your situation, it's very interesting because it poses a different scenario. And he says that in this case, there is a basic dualism that would be evident in the personality. So I went back, of course, and immediately pulled up my before birth new moon chart for myself and my partner, and super fascinated by what I found. I then dialed those charts into the exact minute at the location of the birth was, and started considering the ascendant and a little bit more. And that was really interesting too. And it's a little abstract. I don't like to, those of you that know me, I think that there's a lot of things that I've really loved about astrology, and you can get lost in the weeds, so to speak. What I used to call mental masturbation. And it's fun, but it's the reason I love the EA paradigm that Jeffrey Wolf Green teaches, is that for me, it gave me this strong foundation or lens or context to put everything else through, and that the bottom line of the soul's desire, the deepest emotional security needs, the nature of the ego and personality, the choice making that the individual is making, these are the things that ultimately shape and dictate the evolution within a lifetime. And that context through Pluto and the nodes and the rulers of the nodes is informed and given more, nuances and subtleties through all the other pieces that you can look at and add to that. Just an example of something that I would say that's fun, but really out there and in the weeds, so to speak. I mean, a couple of examples. I'm not trying to encourage you to get super crazy out there, but it depends on what type of astrologer you are. If you're studying and you're new, I guess my encouragement is to just not lose context of the foundation of the chart, and have one kernel piece override. But it's just how much weight do you give say a symbol for where a planet is in your chart? How much significance does, say, the symbol, I use the Sabian symbols, there's other symbol sets, for the new moon before birth? Is it relevant? How relevant? Is it more relevant that we're observing that it's in the same or different sign than the sun? So to me, that's the first core principle that we're looking at with this, is are we talking about the new moon before birth being in the same sign as the sun? Or are we talking about this dualism where you have the new moon before birth in a different archetype? And from there you can add these details. What's the next most significant detail to add on before birth new moon charts? I'm not going to get into that now because it gets really technical, and I think that most of you probably can go back in time and figure out when that new moon was, and at least consider that. I think that's like a nice piece. Now, but yeah, just to complete my thought, I mean, when I first moved out here, I met Robert Blaschke, rest in peace. Loved him, and he was teaching at the Oregon Astrological Association, something like that. I don't know what it was called. It's evolved. I would go down to Portland and heard him talk, bought his books, and his first book was on progressions, was brilliant. I have that. And his second book was called Sabian Aspect Orbs, which he introduced this concept of basically you calculate the degrees of separation between any two planets in your chart, and then you look up the Sabian symbol that correlates to that degree. Example, let's say you've got a Mars-Pluto square. As an evolutionary astrologer, I jump to a planetary pair that's really significant for evolutionary astrologers, or let's say you looked at your rulers of the South Node and North Node in their phasal relationship. Anyway, in my example of looking at Mars and Pluto, let's say that you see that they're in a first quarter square and that they have 93, 92 degrees and 56 minutes of separation. So you would basically look at the 93rd symbol, which in this case would be the third degree of Cancer in the zodiac, as a symbol that correlates to the relationship between the two planets. And I've done this for all my significant planet pairs, and I mean, I was kind of blown away. It was super interesting, super fascinating. It is extra information and insight and dynamic about that relationship between two bodies in your chart. But, like Jeffrey would say, phase first. If you don't understand the phase and then that aspect that two planets are in, and then relative to the house and sign that they're in the chart next, this is another layer to go deeper. Side note there. So back to, I'm weaving in two things. I'm going to get back a little more into the sun. It's supposed to be about identity, but it is. You'll see how it ties in. And the new moon before birth. Because as an evolutionary astrologer, what I want you to do is I want you to look at the new moon before birth chart kind of with like the evolutionary astrologer detective lens frame of mind when you do that. And what I mean by that is, I'm just going to use myself as an example. I theoretically, like I do when I don't have planets square my lunar nodes. So my lunar nodes are 28 Aries Libra in some minutes, right? And then my sun technically would be squaring them at 3 degrees Aquarius in some minutes. Now that is 5 degrees past the square, right? And it's the sun. And so what Jeffrey teaches about evolutionary astrology is a sun square the nodes doesn't imply a quote-unquote skip step, but it implies the potential for one to form. Now, when I considered this new moon chart before my birth, what I noticed was that the new moon before I was born was at 29 degrees Capricorn and in a very tight square to the nodal axes. So the whole lunation cycle before my birth is all about this last degree of Capricorn squaring the Aries Libra nodes. And one of the things that Dane Rudhyar talks about the new moon before birth this is another element that I haven't said yet about it, is that these aspects of the psyche, especially if it's in a different sign, are very much like deeply rooted in the past of the psyche and the soul. So, like in my case, having a before birth new moon in Capricorn implies first that there's this Capricorn archetype that's an older, deeper rooted thing than my current sun sign Aquarius expression. I agree. It makes sense to me. And that has led to a dualism. But now, as an evolutionary astrologer, already having some of this knowledge about looking at a square to the nodes and what it means, to me, one of the first things that was really fascinating about this before birth new moon chart was it gave me another piece to this puzzle where I've already kind of been asking myself this question about, like, does my sun in my chart represent a potential to develop a square to the nodes when it's not ruling one of my lunar nodes. It's past the square by 5 degrees. And in context, I would say it's interesting because in context with what I read from Dane Rudhyar's book and integrating that into evolutionary astrology, to me, I just felt like I had my whole understanding of evolutionary astrology itself evolve. And this is something that I've talked about with Steve Wolfson, and we've had these conversations about the need for evolutionary astrology to evolve, and how it's evolving to me in this scenario is that I've just gained this additional insight that kind of, to me, it confirms that my soul is coming from a deeper rooted place where the square to the nodes was more active and more prominent, and that this lifetime is a potential to resolve and integrate that further. It doesn't mean I'm going to. It doesn't mean that I won't show up as a skip step in another lifetime still. But to me, it does show that it's the square to the nodes itself is a deeper, older rooted pattern, the new moon before birth. And then that progressive 5 degrees forward sun separating to square the nodes implies that, in this lifetime, my soul does want to move on and forward from that. Now, if you find something like this in your own chart, there are other clues also that you can weave in, and I don't have time. Do I have time? I don't know. I don't. I'm not gonna just like go into all of this, but you can see often through progressions, transits, or arcs, other super significant, and this again, it's like I don't want people to get like lost in the weeds, but like where by progression are the rulers of your lunar nodes. Maybe they haven't moved because they're an outer planet, but maybe they've moved significantly. Maybe they're doing something very significant at a certain time in your life that correlate to some deeper resolution that ties back to the new moon before birth, or not. I'm not trying to like pull something out of a hat that's not there, but if it begins to form and tie together, this is us being detectives and putting together all of the pieces that we have. So I found a really fascinating piece with that. And it does kind of raise this whole question of, how many of you out there yourselves or someone the new moon before they were born was square the nodes. As an evolutionary astrologer, I've never had that conversation once with another fellow evolutionary astrologer. I think that it's a helpful thing to think about, and or was there a planet at the new moon square the nodes? Maybe it wasn't the new moon itself, but maybe there was another planet, and then when the individual is born, that planet then has separated from the square. But at the core of their being, and there's a deeper, older pattern within them that's so familiar with that square, and you might not get that by looking at just the natal chart. You follow me? So I wanted to invite, if anyone's out there that has a new moon before birth, and you look at this and you have some breakthrough that you want to share, I'd be, excited to look at it and celebrate that discovery with you. And if you're willing to share, and I thought it was good material, I'd be happy to use an example here on a podcast. So that's a little excitement on all that. And now, I'm going to try to keep this a little shorter for today. So let's see. Other things that I wanted to mention. Back to the whole sun. Because, like if the sun is tied to the evolutionary past, then let's say, for example, the south node is in Leo. Sun rules the south node. The sun ties to the evolution of the ego and identity relative to the soul's past, right? So it's kind of hard to escape the concept that the sun might not be connected to the past. If the sun's conjunct one of the nodes and there's a square to the node, if either of the nodes are in Leo, if Pluto's in Leo, if there's a really strong, evolutionary fifth house signature, all of these things could tie into the sun being more intricately connected to the story of the evolutionary past. I do personally think that there's truth in what Jeffrey teaches about the sun being the current life purpose, and at the same time, I see that there's a lot of scenarios in the chart where by rulership and certain potential scenarios and alignments, that the sun does get kind of wrapped up into the past life story, and it's more than just the current life purpose. So that's my little thing on that. Let's see. Take a drink here. Other thoughts about identity that have been inspiring me a lot is just that identity can be very fixed. But obviously, like the moon itself is always constantly moving in the sky. It's changeable. It's changing all the time. And so even though Cancer's cardinal archetype, to me, I think of the moon as constantly changing and evolving, just like its correlation to the evolutionary process itself. Our identities and egos evolve. Granted, it is a slower process, but they are changing and evolving. Within that, this is where some of the teachings of Jeffrey have really kind of hit, just like they helped me make sense of things that didn't make sense before I got into EA. So basically, in evolutionary astrology, we have this whole Cancer Capricorn polarity, or Moon Saturn, 4th 10th, and as the 4th house is this whole seat of ego and personality, self-identity, stemming from early experiences and formative experiences and memories. And then the 10th house is this outer, factors of that define reality, that tell us, this is reality. Like when a child reaches the age of 7, it's kind of like that first Saturn square. in some regard, Saturn's saying this is reality, but it's really more like the child is like getting a taste of, this is the reality that society and the adults around me prescribe to. And these are the definitions of what that means for me. And according to the EA paradigm, there's going to be different responses to that. If the soul is in a consensus evolutionary stage, they're of course going to prescribe to those norms that then, especially after the first Saturn square, begin to shape the identity progressively and define us. Now, if the soul's individuating, of course, they're not going to settle for a definition of identity by an exterior authority or source, right? And of course, in this sense, like identity could be our relationship to gender itself. It could be the roles within that gender, or the identity, or the performance expectations of being in that gender. All these need to be individually defined if the soul's individuating. That the personality, the ego, is focused on the individuation process. Therefore, they aren't going to be defining those things. It doesn't mean that some things. It doesn't mean that everything won't align with the culture of origin. It just means that they are in this process of defining them for themselves. So the blueprint of the societal norm isn't going to work for them, of course. We know this. Now, another principle here is that identity, like for once souls are highly evolved, there is not like the gender that they incarnate and in, this is my understanding of that, is like sort of, I mean, it might be relevant in sense of maybe that's what divine will is, but like in the sense of like identifying or clinging to or being like, I am this, I am male, or I am female, or I am whatever. Like that's, like an evolved soul has integrated the polarities of masculine and feminine qualities of soul and being, the yin and yang get integrated over time. And one of the ways that this naturally occurs over a greater evolutionary period is that souls incarnate in different gender. So this is a part of the teaching of EA. And so once you understand that, you can understand that souls may have incarnated as one gender more recently and then switched gender in an incarnation. And Jeffrey Wolf Green kind of talked about that dynamic as like a new pair of pants. Like it's like uncomfortable, it's not familiar, but like this is who I am, this is the body that I'm in, this is weird. Feels like uncomfortable and weird. And so we all have, each individual then has an individual response to that experience. And I would say also that the cultural norms of the greater culture and subcultures within that inform that experience also, and how one responds to that. There are things like you can see things like, so it's not, these things aren't always going to be true, but something like if the moon is in balsamic phase to Saturn, it can imply that the soul is preparing to switch identities. I say the balsamic phase is the end, it's the letting go, it's the breakdown, and Saturn kind of being the definition or structure of ego and identity. This is how it's defined now, but oh wait, it's like mutable, it's changing a lot right now. They're getting ready, the soul. And so if you're born with the balsamic moon Saturn and you feel like you're, preparing to change gender identity in another lifetime, and I'm not saying like, go change your gender right now. I'm just like, if that's what you want to do or you not want to do, I'm just saying, like, you could also just sense that you've been in this gender for a long time, and that like there's some other dynamic going on. And if you have that lens to consider it through, it could be helpful to self explore some of the dynamics in your own psyche, to be like, what does it mean that you have a balsamic Saturn moon? Yeah, Jeffrey taught a lot about, I believe he had some time in Seattle and did spend a lot of time with a lot of the trans community back in, the 80s and 90s. And so he had a lot of firsthand direct experience at people who definitely were outside of the cultural norms back then, but he was getting to really see how these things expressed through evolutionary astrology. And he taught about things like, sometimes you can see through squares to the nodes that a skip step can be something unresolved from previous incarnation in the other gender. I've totally seen this in charts, and it's really fascinating. And it doesn't always mean it's true, but it can be. I've seen it with, like, say, a planet in Cancer squaring Aries Libra nodes. I've seen it with 4th, 10th house or Cancer Capricorn nodal axes. Again, it's possible, but it's not like, oh, that means that. It's something to consider. And there are other factors, of course. But, and I on my Pluto in Cap recap podcast, one of the things I brought up was, obviously, like, gender and gender identity became such a hot topic with Pluto and Capricorn. And I think that that's the nature of Pluto. Pluto is like, let's break down these norms, right? And there's responses to Pluto, like, Pluto polarizes, right? So you have one polarity that's like, yes, let's break down these cultural norms of gender and gender identity. And there was great evolutionary steps. Now, simultaneously, that triggered the collective culture that was resistant to that to be like, whoa, this is way too much. And now I'm going to, like, cling to the old cultural definitions and norms that make sense to me because I am not, like, understanding this. And then we have this increased polarity. And then, unfortunately, you have, people that then use that polarity to gain profit and divide people and use it in divisive ways to create further wedges and separation and misunderstandings. And I feel like we've seen a lot of that. And then people get all extreme and close off even more in their minds and think like everybody's like one way about it. It's an unfortunate thing, and I hope that we can evolve past that. But yeah, I'm gonna wrap this up here, I think, on that note. But I'll leave you with one more note, and this was another thing on identity that like another piece that I just really resonated with from Jeffrey's teachings on identity. And that, like, well, one, we always need to look at the culture of birth and consider what the conditioned norm of behavior is, and then, look at the personality in the chart in relationship to that. So if you see someone who's born as a male and they're raised to be a strong man in a society that has that definition, but then you look and they've got like their moon's in the 12th house or their moon's in Pisces, right? You kind of have this certain crisis of identity within that. Like, how are they going to respond? So again, you're going to ask, like, what's the evolutionary stage of that individual? And because they could do different things. They could do like a Pisces 12th house thing. They could be in hiding. They could just struggle to fit in entirely. But if they're more towards, it depends on their overall nature and the overall chart of who they are. But one of the things that I learned about that is that whole like standing on the precipice, that whole 12th house Pisces. If somebody is afraid of going into the abyss, and if the abyss is the reality of how emotional and chaotic the psyche really is, then, and there's this deeper Saturnian like security with, this is who I am, this is an identity that I have. Because if you let that go, you like lose your sense of like who. I mean, you could have someone with a moon in Pisces or the 12th house, and honestly, they're like, what is my identity? Who am I? I'm not even sure. And for some people, they can be more secure with having that, or having their sense of identity, like moon and Aries are in the first house, kind of be in this process of discovering who they are. Neither of those Aries, Pisces, first house, 12th house processes are strongly supported by the society. And so a first house Aries moon, becomes like Aries on steroids. And kind of in a similar way, the 12th house or Pisces moon can cling to some remnant of identity out of the fear of losing any sense of who they are. It's like taking a bunch of mushrooms and you're like, this is still a bad frame, like this is still reality. This is still reality. And then someone's like, it's okay. It's going to be okay. You can let go, but you're still holding on. All right. Well, I got to get going. Nice to put out a little thing. Let me know if you have some thoughts or what you think about that. I do have that invitation out there for you. If you have some great insights about the new moon before you were born, especially in relation to the EA paradigm, which is what I make an effort here to come back and tie things into. Until next time, this is Redwood.